Also want to talk a little bit about why I think it is engineers need an entrepreneurial mindset. You know, it's not always an easy conversation to have with your faculty. But apparently this is a trend that's been going on for a very long time. And I think in the Reformation in Europe, we began to see really roots of the problem as it began to develop. You see, after the French Revolution, there was a real problem with eliminating people, and they used the guillotine quite a lot. And this one particular day, they had this line of people being guillotined, and the first person in line was a priest. So they put him down on the guillotine, and they raised the blade, let the blade go. It comes crashing down with terrible speed, and just about 6 inches above his head, it suddenly stopped. And they didn't know what to do. So they looked around at each other, nothing like this had happened before. So the priest stood up and he said, well, you know, must be an act of God. So we better let him go. So they let him go, and the next person in line happened to be an attorney. They put him down on the guillotine, raised the blade, came down with terrible speed, it stopped 6 inches above his head, and he immediately got up and he cited the precedent that the last time that this had happened, they let an attorney go. I mean, they let the priest go, so they have to let him go too. So now people are getting really quite suspicious. And of course, the third person in line happened to be an engineer. Being a curious sort, he insisted on laying face up. So they raised the blade, just about to release it, and he immediately stood up, waved his hands, and said, wait. I found the problem. There's a screw about 6 inches above my head that's not supposed to be there. And that's been the problem with engineers ever since. We solve problems, but we're not thinking about the context. Okay? Entrepreneurial mindset would have changed all of that. I'd like to talk a little bit today about a number of things. Not so much about Olin, but what I think is the future of education, and engineering education in particular. And I'll make some references along the way to what we're doing. So the outline is basically these three things. So what exactly is Olin College? Secondly, what are they doing there? Although I'm not going to spend much time on it, most of what we're going to do is talk about lessons learned. So what has Olin learned from this experiment? So first off, the founding of the school. So FW Olin College was actually chartered in 1997 by this private foundation, the FW Olin Foundation. It has a long history in higher ed. 78 buildings on 58 university campuses say Olin Hall on them, including Cornell, Vanderbilt, Johns Hopkins, USC, dozens of others. They ended that grants program out of frustration and created Olin College. Frustration because engineering education needed to change. And in the 90s, the National Science Foundation had spent over $100 million trying to create systemic change and suspended the program when the external reviews showed that it wasn't working. So Olin was started. I was the first employee in 1999 when I arrived. It wasn't a place yet. Olin College consisted of 5 people, the 4 directors of the Olin Foundation and me. We didn't have land, we didn't have anything. My wife still thinks of this as my midlife crisis. She's probably right. And then you can see the timeline here of how the school unfolded. I put in red this Olin partner here because it's where we mostly learned how things work in education. This is a year in which we had 15 boys and 15 girls who lived in construction trailers on a parking lot for a year. They weren't taking courses. We were doing outrageous experiments that you cannot do in any university that's offering degrees because we expected the experiments to fail. You can't set up an experiment at your university deliberately to fail because it's unethical. We learned an amazing amount, which I'll talk about. So the person who's most responsible for this is Mr. Milas, who was the president of the Olin Foundation at the time. And he basically said, there's a lot of unhappiness about the way engineering is taught in this country. We need to break the mold. And so that's what Olin was about. They got a lot of advice along the way, and I realized from sitting in the back, you probably barely can see the stuff at the bottom of these slides, so I'm going to try and read for you a little bit. The person on the left is Joe Bordogna, who was the chief operating officer at NSF for a long time. Joe was the dean of engineering at Penn. Some of you probably know him. He ran the Engineering Education Coalitions program. He was a chief advisor to the Olin Foundation at the time. Also John Prados, who at the time was the president of ABET. He's the fellow who led the Criteria 2000 program. He was one of our founding trustees. So they wrote what we call the 10 Commandments at Olin. These are the 10 founding precepts, the conditions for their funding the school, which include a lot of things I'll talk about. But at the beginning, in the preamble, they explain the purpose of the school. And if you read this, you basically discover that Olin is not a school. Olin is designed to become an education laboratory. You should think of it as essentially a privately funded education laboratory in STEM. So all we do is constantly churn and change and try new things, and it doesn't matter unless you can give it away. So Olin's whole purpose, we cannot meet our mission by staying home and teaching classes. As far as we know, this is unique. I don't know of another school in the world that has that as its mission. So you might think of it this way. So Olin College is supposed to be this little tugboat that pushes perpendicularly to the bow of this giant ship that we call higher education. That's what we're supposed to do. So we'll do things in very different ways, not expecting that everybody's going to do what we do, but if we can change the course a few degrees starboard or a few degrees port, then we will have met our mission. We have a way of doing this. Some of you asked about this even at the coffee break. It's called the Collaboratory, where we work with other universities. We've been visited by more than 420 universities in the past 5 years. We have really substantial partnerships with a number of them, quite large institutions like the University of Illinois. And these folks come and spend a week or 2 weeks in the summer on various programs, all faculty members, usually between 50 and 100 faculty members at a time. There is a lot more about this on our website if you're actually interested. So that's the end of my commercial. Okay? As a result of these collaborations, there was a recent book written about our efforts with the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, who has, as you may know, completely changed the first 2 years of their undergraduate program in engineering, not to follow what Olin does, but to use the experimental process that we use to create new methods of teaching there. So what is it that Olin does anyway? Well, the current Olin model for engineering education, and I'll say this as a current model because it constantly changes, looks something like this. So first of all, here's what Olin is. I won't read all this. You can read it. It's a small place. It's limited to 350 students. We have no aspirations to grow, although I would like to grow the faculty some so we can work with more universities. The important stuff is in red down there at the bottom. We have no academic departments. You probably can't read this. I can see everybody doing this, so I'll try and read it. No academic departments, which is probably the most important decision we made. We have no tenure. We have very low tuition, highly subsidized for the students who want to be the guinea pigs in this. And essentially, everything at Olin has an expiration date, including the curriculum. Okay? Imagine that you could expire your curriculum at your institution and not have this, revolt as a result. That's the concepts. That's what the campus looks like, at least when it's not icy. This is something about what the academic program does, and I'm not going to go into much more detail than this. No one comes to Olin without going through a very extensive weekend of collaborative interview activities. They put on small teams, they design and build things, they put them in a small room and see how they deal with controversy. How do you feel about the Iraq War? What are your feelings on that? They're asked to stand and deliver in front of a group as a team. Everybody has to speak. We ask them what their passions are. And when we're doing this process through which an entire weekend, there is no way you can be on stage and hide your true feelings. You're going to see them let their hair down and be who they really are. And we have no idea what their application looks like or what their test scores are. It's completely sealed. So the people who are doing this evaluation don't know anything about the students except what they see when they interview them. There's a reason for that. The core principles at Olin are what we call design thinking. Some of you know all about this. This actually comes out of the design world, or the art world. They do 10 to 20 project teams. At the end of the program in the fourth year, they have a sort of a senior project on steroids where a company spends $50,000 to support the project of 4 to 6 students. At the end of every semester, every student has to stand and deliver in front of the community something from their project work. This is our version of a music recital in a music academy, where every kid has to play something. And it changes. See, the deal is, a good course changes what you know, but a great course changes who you are. And the way you change who you are is by standing and delivering. You have skin in the game. The other interesting thing here is that all students have to start and run a business to graduate. Now, Olin, we didn't talk about it in this talk, but Olin is actually not an isolated school of engineering on some island in Antarctica. It's in a community, and we are in fact part of a very close community of 2 other colleges. Babson College, which is a business school. You might have heard of it, particularly if you're interested in entrepreneurship. We actually bought the land from Babson and built the college there in order to enable cross-enrollment. And I've been a member of the board of trustees at Babson for over a dozen years. So they're quite deeply embedded. And also Wellesley College. Wellesley College is 2 miles away, and we have a shuttle bus that goes every 30 minutes, and kids cross-enroll for free. So in essence, this is a virtual university of these 3 places. But guess what? None of this matters, in my view. You can come and try to benchmark all these courses. It doesn't matter. You won't get the same outcome that we did. We didn't get the same outcome when we benchmarked others. What's important is not the curriculum. What's important is the culture. And the part that I think is most important to us is that you hear this at the water cooler constantly by students. They'll tell you, we've never worked this hard in our life. Olin is not a party school, okay? But there's nothing else we'd rather be doing. And I'm sure you're seeing that on your campus too. If you look around, you'll find pockets of students and programs where this is exactly the culture that's developed. And so the whole idea here is to find a way to spread that. So now, lessons learned. This is the important part. I'm going to take a broad view here. First off, let me just talk to you about what I think the transitions, the evolution over time of what it means to be educated is all about. So if you look over here on the left, so the sort of traditional view of education, people talk a lot about the knowledge economy. The World Bank does a lot of this around the world, talking about bringing third world countries into the knowledge economy. This is an educational model which imagines that you insert content into kids' heads. That's how you get knowledge. This happens, the main learning resource for this is the faculty members who serve as a sage on the stage, kind of like what I'm doing up here, which is like totally not what we should do. The learning environment that we create for them is primarily rows of seats with a blackboard because it's efficient for cramming stuff into people's heads. And the outcome is about what you know. So you might have sort of imagined if this works really well, every single graduate would be a national winner on Jeopardy, okay? You know stuff, just all kinds of stuff. But then, along came Google. In fact, if you watch Jeopardy these days, you can actually get the answers to a lot of the questions by Googling them while they're on TV. So what do you think employers are going to do now about paying big bucks for somebody who can answer stuff on their feet? It's sort of changed the value proposition now. So this changes actually to a transition that we're currently underway with, which what I call is the maker economy. Now in this economy, the educational model has to be different. It's more about not just putting content in, but there has to be something that comes out. You have to be able to do things. You have to be able to make stuff. And this often happens by watching somebody else, trying it yourself, comparing the two, sort of minimizing the error signal, and you get better at this with practice. And so this has now changed everything. So the learning model is no longer about taking notes in a lecture hall. The teachers changed the role to the guide on the side. The learning environment is no longer a classroom with rows of seats, but it's small groups with maker projects, kind of like what we were doing just before we got up here. And the outcome is not about what you know, it's about what you can do. And in fact, employers care about what you can do. So, and you can see this if you look at the graduates in your placement office, and you look at where they go and you look at the starting salaries they get, employers are paying more for students that have resumes that show they can do stuff than they are for the 4.0s that have never done anything. And the kids have figured this out too. I think this is still going in the future towards what you might call the innovation economy, where the real value proposition is not so much what you put in, it's what comes out. And here it's about ideas. It's about innovation. It's about creative ideas and insights. Sort of what Jamie Heinemann was talking about. The teacher is now different. The teacher is not the sage on the stage. It's probably closer to peers and mentors. And I'm putting a question mark here because I think we don't really know yet what this learning model is going to look like. Everyone's experimenting with this. The learning environment is different. It's not so much about small groups with a project as it is what I'd call, it's coming from within, intrinsic motivation and design thinking, or probably the learning environment, which works best for this. And the purpose of this education is what you conceive. That's where the big bucks are. That's where people are going to pay a lot of money. Now, this is not new either. There's a fellow named Yeats, you might have heard about, who said, education is not filling a pail, but lighting a fire. And if you look at this transition, on the left side, it's really filling a pail, and on the right side, it's coming from inside. Now, why education must change? I mean, these are forces that are happening, whether we pay attention to them or not. This graph on the left, you may have already seen. This is a graph of world population growth throughout all of history. And until about 1920, it was below 1 billion. Today it's 7 billion. We're expecting 9 billion by 2050. And there are a lot of people who are talking about this graph. There is no aspect of human existence on this planet that won't be changed by the fact that the population is exploding. Okay? No aspect of it. Everything is going to change. And as a result, the National Academy of Engineering put together this group to think about the challenges of life in the 21st century. You can't see these. They're on their website. They fall into 4 small groups, though. They're all global. They're all complex. They're multidisciplinary. If you wonder what they are, just watch the national news tonight. I guarantee you the headlines of the national news will touch one of these 4 major issues in great detail. They have to do with security. Have you heard anything about North Korea lately? They have to do with sustainability. Have you heard about global climate change? They have to do with global health. Have you heard about Ebola? They have to do with enhancing life. So, for example, we have this habit of believing that our kids are going to have at least as good a lifestyle as we did. How sustainable do you think that is as the population keeps exploding and the planet doesn't? We as engineers are the people who are not supposed to be driving the ambulances out fixing problems that are occurring, but preventing them by foreseeing them and designing an environment which makes that impossible. These problems, though, are not technology problems. They're coupled. They're scientific, social, economic, political, even religious problems. Okay? Because if people don't follow the rules, you don't have a solution. This red line is an existential threat. This is pretty heavy stuff, so I think we need to back up for a minute and see what we can learn from it. You know, history has faced existential threats in the past. Probably the biggest challenge of all is this one. And it's a little bit light. So what you can read is they decide among themselves how they're going to deal with these challenges, and they said, let's divide into classes, form nation states, and compete for global resources. That's a great plan, don't you think? Well, we have the same problem. Let's divide into Carnegie classifications, form independent colleges, and compete for students and federal money. How do you think that's going to work out for us? I think it's time for us to begin to think as a community, what do we need to do together to deal with these issues? The grand challenges, by the way, are quite important. This is a wave of interest that's growing across the country. You may have seen this. You may have heard something about them. In 2009, a Business Week article mentioned that students may resist geek studies, but they'll flock in for the opportunity to change the world. if you simply frame what we're already doing in engineering courses as the address of the human species to the global grand challenges of the 21st century, you'd be amazed at how many people are interested. Is this important? Well, let me mention this. Last year, at May, during the commencement season, about 4% of all the bachelor's degrees in America went to students who studied any kind of engineering on any university. 4%. That compares with 12% in Europe and over 30% in Asia. And that's a market share that's probably declining. That's inflated because in the last few years, the percentage of your enrollment, of certainly the enrollment in large public universities, that consists of international students who are coming here paying big bucks for American education is going up. Those kids have a restriction on where they can work. Most of them will go back, so they're not actually feeding the workforce in the US. How many years will it be before we don't really produce engineers in this country? Is it because we don't have kids who are bright in science and math? Absolutely not. We're producing enormous numbers of kids that are extremely bright in science and math. They just have no interest in fixing the guillotine, okay? We need to present them with global challenges, things that matter to them. Now, we talk a lot about innovation, and I think it's important to realize that these challenges are going to require innovation. This is creativity. This involves entrepreneurial thinking. It's what we saw with Jamie Heinemann's presentation too, but the word is used a lot in ways which are confusing. So I want to provide a little bit of a framework. This idea about creativity is basically the process of generating original ideas and insights. That's not me talking, that's Sir Ken Robinson. So how many people have heard of Ken Robinson? Probably lots of hands go up, okay. Inventiveness is the process of generating original ideas and insights that have value. Okay, there's a difference. Artists are creative. Inventors create things that have value. But innovation is actually the process of generating original ideas and insights that have value and then implementing them in ways that change the way people live. Guess what? If it's not implemented, it's just an idea. There are lots of ideas. The world is not bereft of having good ideas. It's the implementation part, which is where the hard stuff happens. Really important. By the way, the NAE has a wonderful coffee table book. You should all have one. The Greatest Technology Achievements of the 20th Century. Okay, how many have this book already? It's a really cool book. My aunt and uncle still don't know what I do as an engineer, so I make sure they see this. Stuff like in the 20th century, in 1900, the average lifespan in the US was about 43 years, 44 years, something like that. In 2000, the average lifespan is like 78 years. Almost doubled. How did that happen? Technology played the key role. Fundamentally, by the way, most people in 1900 died from waterborne disease. They don't die from that in 2000 because of civil engineering that's made clean water sources available. So a lot of this is about all success stories. They're all about things, okay? But in the 21st century, it's not so much about things. It's about human behavior, and that's the more complicated stuff. Now, we have a concept of innovation which has developed out of some peculiar experiences. So for example, when I was a young faculty member, I was taught by this engineering-centric view that all innovation comes from technology. And in fact, I was encouraged by my dean to go visit our congressman every February and tell him that he needs to increase the NSF budget because it's good for the country. See, because here's how this works. NSF will invest money into universities. Universities, because of academic freedom, will generate what I call just-in-case science. Lots of it, curiosity-driven. Don't really have a need for this, but it's who would not want to learn this stuff? So let's try this. The universities will then take some of this just-in-case science, throw it over the wall to the tech transfer office in the college, which has, a number of lawyers, patents, and some venture capital. They have apparently this big jar of pixie dust, and they'll sprinkle this on some of these ideas, which then turn into large companies. Who knew? There's a problem with the pixie dust, which we'll get back to later. Nevertheless, these new companies generate jobs, they generate new tax revenue, which goes to the government so they can return the money to the university. End of story. Perfect, okay? We got the internet that way. We got all this. And then I happened to be sitting in the boardroom at Babson College. Now, Babson is a business school. They only give business degrees. They're rated #1 in entrepreneurship. And guess what? They use the word innovation all the time. Now, none of these guys is an engineer, though, because since it's a business school, the board of trustees is like 80 to 90% alumni who all have MBAs. So these are all MBAs, okay? And to them, they're constantly talking about innovation, and they never mention science. And I keep thinking, I'm doing some kind of penance for some, previous sins, I guess. Hang out with all these Neanderthals that don't realize it's actually about science. They don't even do science here. And then one day it occurred to me, you know what? If innovation is really implementing ideas that change the way people live on a big scale, what do you think of the credit card? You think that might have changed the way people live? Have you heard of the financial crisis in 2008? Financial derivatives? Some of our kids did that. Okay, these are engineers that did that. Maybe there's more to this innovation thing than just science. Maybe there are other ways. And so, in fact, you begin to reflect on what our educational process is about. And it's possible that the way we've organized ourselves, like the dinosaurs, is getting in the way of producing the innovators that we need. So this results in this broader way of thinking about innovation. Now let me begin by saying when we're in K through 12, we're all being taught a mixture of subjects at the same time. We have some natural science and math, but we also have social studies, we have arts, we have physical education. Then we graduate and go off to college. Kids major in something. This could be a map of, let me say, the University of Michigan. Okay, let me pick on them. It could be any university. This is a map. So up in the upper left-hand corner is the School of Engineering. Okay? In the upper right-hand corner is the School of Business. In other buildings, there's a quad. Kids spend most of their time there. Down in this red circle at the bottom, which you may not be able to see, is the arts and sciences. So that's where they learn psychology, arts, and humanities. Now, what's the significance of this? Well, if you're going to get an ABET accredited engineering degree, 3/4 of the credit hours that you take are going to be in that quad. They're going to be from people who have math and science backgrounds, and they're going to be looking at the world through a lens in which every question that they ask can be related to the question of feasibility. Is it possible to do this based on what we know about the natural laws? And that's pretty much it. By the way, the folks in business have a similar lens on life. It's all about viability. I can tell you that from sitting in the Babson boardroom. Okay, it's all about, what are the legal restrictions on this? What about the initial capital it takes to generate this? Can you sustain this over time? What's the cash flow look like? Viability. And by the way, AACSB accreditation requirements for them require that half of all the credit hours be focused on management, accounting, marketing, so forth. Now, in the desirability area, the other parts of campus where kids are studying psychology, art, literature, it's completely different. In fact, there are no uniform standards for accreditation in history. Every school thinks of it on their own. And therefore, it's possible for students to study history without taking any natural science or business at all. I know that. I have a daughter who did it. Okay? She got a nice degree in economics from a very fine private school in New England and never had a single natural science course in 4 years. And she had only one math course, which was statistics. Okay, and by the way, the questions that they ask are all related to what I call human desires. Things like, what is the meaning of love? What is the meaning of beauty? Or what is the meaning of truth or justice? Do you think those are important questions? They have everything to do with why people do what they do in life, and they always have. They just are not questions that are measured by numbers or spreadsheets. Okay, so they don't make it into the engineering schools. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, this matters for one really simple reason, and that is it's only at the intersection of these three things that any innovation happens. Let me challenge you to think about any innovation you can think of that changed life in a profound way that wasn't simultaneously feasible and also viable and also desirable in the population that adopted it. And actually, the desirability part is usually the hard part. There are lots of cell phones out there that are obvious, they work, and they would make money, but they don't sell. Okay? Given a choice, people will choose another one. Getting the desirability thing is important. Now, thinking about this innovation that we need the next generation to do, the grand challenges require STEM competence, of course, but they won't be solved by STEM subjects alone. Let me, in fact, go back here to just make an additional point. See this desirability circle? We already mentioned that you can get to the innovation from the feasibility circle through things like new science ideas. You can also get to them through the viability circle through things like the credit card, new business models. You ever heard of iTunes? You think that might have had something to do with the iPhone's success? But you can also get there through desirability. Have you ever heard of the company Facebook? What does Facebook sell? I think Facebook sells an opportunity to tell your personal story to a group of people who you care about. Who knew there's a business model there? Apparently, every human has a fundamental need to be the most important person in somebody else's life. And the way we do that is by telling stories, and we tell them in creative ways, with videos, with all kinds of images, with personal details you really shouldn't share, because we have this compulsion to be the most important person in somebody else's life. That's what Zuckerberg was capitalizing on, okay? That pathway to a company that is now one of the largest capitalized companies on the stock exchange came through the desirability circle, not through feasibility. Okay, no amount of doubling down on hard science courses is going to produce this kind of innovator. It's not only what you know that matters, it's your attitudes, behaviors, and motivations, what we, in a derogatory sense in engineering schools, usually call soft skills, that are the center of this change. So, 21st century innovators require more than technical knowledge. It's your attitude that matters the most. More often than not, your attitude determines your altitude in life. I'm sure you've seen this before. Not your aptitude. Okay? Two really simple stories about this. We have a trustee who has pointed out that a very, very famous technical university in America produces graduates that routinely generate comments from interviewers in companies that they're not interested in employing them. And the reason is their attitude, okay? These graduates emit the attitude that they are doing this company a favor by taking the time out of their day to interview with them. Because I graduated from this famous place, see? This is not a great problem. There's a wonderful movie out now. It's called The Lost Boys of the Sudan. Has anybody heard of this? Has anybody seen this movie? Isn't it interesting? This group of kids arrived in the US with absolutely zero skills. They didn't know how a telephone worked. And they succeeded. Why? Because of their attitude, okay? Attitude actually matters. I think this is probably not a hard sell. The hard part's coming later. Attitudes, behaviors, and motivations. And we have a list of these, which we've called soft skills. Entrepreneurial mindset is at the top of this particular list, but you can read the others. We're not the only ones talking about this, folks. There are lots of groups around the US that have been talking about these issues for a long time. The National Academy of Engineering has a report in final stages right now called Educate to Innovate. Guess what? It's about the list of topics on this soft skills list. There's also the Grand Challenge Scholars Program, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, which has 5 of these things on its list. The Council on Competitiveness, the National Engineering Forum, has a new wave of meetings going around, summit meetings, about capacity, capability, and competitiveness. The capability is about these soft skills. IBM, have you heard of the T-shaped engineer project? That's for over a decade. They've been pounding on this soft skills idea. In fact, they've developed their business model, of course, has completely changed. 85% of their revenue now comes from services. So they've been trying everything they can think of to generate services science within universities. The STEM Connector Group, which is a very diverse, large group of companies, is now pushing hard on employability skills and innovation excellence. These are the foundation. If they don't have these issues before they arrive in the workplace, they're not going to be employable. By the way, I've been involved with every one of these groups. The STEM Connector Group in particular had some very fascinating comments recently about the changes in demographics in the US, which may be correlated with the drop in employability skills. They pointed out that in this generation, there is a larger percentage of the population of kids raised in single-parent families than any generation before. And this is a problem. These kids who were raised in a single-parent family, you think of it this way, a large fraction of their CPU is tied up during school day dealing with processing problems that are going on at home. So they're not able really to concentrate and absorb the material that you're talking to them about. As a result, they don't come to school ready to learn, and they don't come to the workplace with the same attitudes. The idea of being there on time and being ready to work is not built into their DNA. And we're ignoring this. I mean, education generally saying, well, it's not in the calculus book. It's not my problem. The Grand Challenge Scholars Program talks about 5 things. In fact, this is a really interesting project. How many of you already heard about the Grand Challenge Scholars Program? So most people have. Last May, the White House offered an invitation to the National Academy to bring in at least 50 engineering deans from the US who would make a commitment that they would graduate at least 20 students every year that have all 5 of these extracurricular dimensions to their education as engineers to prepare them for the grand challenges. 65 engineering deans have signed on. Since then, it's spreading rapidly through China and through India. This is a global movement. It turns out kids all over the planet are concerned about sustainability, health, security, and the enhancement of life. They really care about these things. By the way, 6 of the 11 ABET requirements, A through K, are focused on soft skills. Isn't that interesting? We don't talk about that very much. We usually wink, nod, do something, look the other way. It's really the calculus that matters. Interesting article over the weekend, Wall Street Journal. Some of you may have seen this. New data underscore financial challenges and low tolerance for risk among young Americans. This graph is the percentage of people under 30 that have a stake in or own a privately held company. It's at a 24-year low. Fewer kids are starting companies today than they have in a generation. This is the need for entrepreneurial mindset, okay? It's huge. Okay, so that's the context. Now in that 15 minutes, I'm going to try to tell you what we can do about this, all right? Lessons learned at Olin. We've been struggling with this. We basically concluded to do the right thing, to produce the technical talent that we need globally, we have to change 3 things. We're teaching the wrong people. I'll let that sink in for a second. We're teaching them the wrong stuff, and we're using teaching methods that are known to be largely ineffective. Otherwise, we're doing a spectacular job. Can you see why it might be 4%? What do you mean, the wrong people? I didn't include slides with books, but this one, in fact, I think is really important. If you're going to produce innovators, I would recommend that you have a look at this book by Tony Wagner, which is called Creating Innovators. And it's a research-based study out of Harvard about what it takes to produce people who think differently, who make these kinds of connections and actually change the world. Who we teach. Are we attracting the right people into engineering? Let me see a show of hands of how many of you are in engineering today because you were good at math in high school. Okay. I actually didn't know what an engineer was. My math teacher said, you're good at engineering, good math, you should be an engineer. I'd never met an engineer until I showed up as a freshman in college. Never met a PhD either at that point. In fact, I'm still not sure I know what an engineer is, but I'm teaching it. Less than 5% of the bachelor's degrees go to engineers. I mentioned that. What about people like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg? Are they engineers? Should they have been engineers? They're leading technology companies. Turns out Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg were both dropouts from Harvard. They both went to liberal arts colleges. Steve Jobs was a dropout from Reed. These were not guys who went to Caltech and MIT, all right? There are bright, innovative people out there. They're just not choosing engineering. Why is that? Because of the way we define engineering, okay? Engineering, in my view, is not a body of knowledge. I know there are whole societies out there that are based on this with an initiative to go forward. I think it involves knowledge, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that engineers need to be people who don't know anything about solid mechanics or fluids. I'm saying engineering is a process. The aircraft industry was designed in a bicycle shop in Ohio, not in a physics lab at a university. They used a process. You know how many times they jumped off that mountain before they got it to fly? Every time it didn't work, there must be a better way, which led to why didn't it work? And then some assumptions, some may have change in hypothesis, a new prototype, and away they went. That process is hardly taught in our engineering schools, but we teach an enormous amount of just-in-case science. We need engineers with multiple intelligences. This is not a random pair of words, okay? This is the work of Howard Gardner, MacArthur Prize winner, Harvard University cognitive scientist, who has a fantastic book called Frames of Mind that he published in 1983. This changed everything. It explains so much of the confusion that we see in education today. We need people with multiple intelligences. So what does that mean? Gardner says everyone has at least 7 independent intelligences. They're brain circuits for this. They are involved in how you make decisions. Most of these you're not even aware of. I mean, you're not consciously deciding to make your heart beat right now, and you're not usually thinking about breathing either, but your brain is. There's a portion of your brain that's dedicated to doing that. Some of these circuits you can override by the cognitive brain saying, I'm going to hold my breath for a while. A lot of it goes on and you're not even aware of it. It's not accessible to memory. These are the things where attitudes, behaviors, and motivations play a key role. Not everything important in life comes from a book. Things like moral reasoning, creativity come from within. That's that third model of education about the innovation economy. It's about that part of the brain. An engineer is a person who envisions what has never been and does whatever it takes to make it happen. That's been our definition at Olin for some time. It's a very broad definition, but it doesn't say anything about science, Rick. What's wrong with this? Yes, I get in trouble frequently, but that's what I'm paid to do. By the way, do you think that might work as a definition for entrepreneurial mindset? You can see why we're friends with the current people. We're all trying to produce the same kind of revolution. We must change what we teach. This is the only data-driven thing in the talk, so I'm going to be quick about this. Are we teaching the right stuff for the 21st century? I think there's a real question about this. So I want to drag you through this thesis that came out 2004 from MIT. Understanding the careers of alumni of the MIT Mechanical Engineering Department. Now, this is not about MIT. The point of using MIT in the example is that everybody looks to MIT as a spire of excellence. Many of us, in fact, I could ask for a show of hands, how many of us have degrees from MIT? It's a great place. So if MIT is having this problem, I imagine lots of people are having this problem, okay? So the survey involves graduates of the ME department from 1992 to 1996. So this was a 10-year later kind of study. 676 email requests, 46% response rate. Statistically, it's quite strong. What did they learn? Okay, so this is a graph that's going to be gibberish, so let me talk a little bit about it. They asked them a question, where did you learn this stuff? And the stuff, these vertical bars that I didn't put any detail on yet, on the left are the core subjects in mechanical engineering: thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, dynamics, strength of materials, so on. And the light blue color that you see, or purple, is to indicate that they learned that as an undergraduate at MIT. That's what they taught me. The stuff in the middle is what we're calling professional skills. So it's not actually, there aren't course titles about this at MIT. They learned a little bit of that there, but look, the big bars are yellow, which says they learned that on the job. And then the stuff on the right are the more long-term philosophical, creative things, which they said, you didn't get so much of that at MIT. Okay, this is probably not a surprise, because I think all of us have those same courses in it. Now, the interesting thing is, they asked them, does it matter? Okay, so what is it that you use today, 10 years later? And they said, well, the stuff in red here, which you'll notice is in the professional skills, is what they use pervasively, and the stuff in blue is what they learned at MIT. Okay. They also asked them, well, how often do you use this stuff? I said, actually, we have never used that since I graduated. On the other hand, these red things, we use this all the time. The next question they asked was, well, how proficient are you supposed to be? Does your boss expect to be an expert in this? I'm not expected to know anything, actually, about this fluid mechanics stuff, but I'm not only supposed to be familiar with it and use it all the time, I'm supposed to lead in it and innovate in these areas of professional skills. Okay? So the conclusion is the professional skills, which are soft skills and non-technical skills, are not learned but are pervasive. These are MIT alumni. This list of technical subjects, which are right out of the core subject for an ME degree at MIT, are all learned, but they're really seldom used. This is what you call just-in-case science. Hard science is technical content. This is not an isolated study, by the way. The National Academy has a number of reports out. You may have read the report, The Engineer of 2020, which has almost exactly the same list and the same sorts of criticism. This has been reported many, many times. Hasn't led to change yet. Finally, how we teach. This is really the end of the talk. So if you're trying to wake up, that would be a good time. A few minutes from now, we'll be getting coffee, lunch. What is the best way to teach today? Okay. Lots of answers to this. One that I like a lot is in this book by John Seeley Brown. Does anybody here know John Seeley Brown and who he is? A few. John Seeley Brown's an interesting character. He was at IBM. He was the chief technology officer at IBM. He was the first director of Xerox PARC, Palo Alto Research Center, where so many aspects of personal computing were invented. In his later years, he's become very interested in how internet-based learning happens and what happens to young people. This book, A New Culture of Learning, which is a very thin, easily read monograph, I'd highly recommend. And he outlines how things are changing. Basically, the model that you get out of this is that the old model was knowledge transfer. The new model is about constructing knowledge, teaching kids how to construct their own knowledge. The old model led to a can't-do attitude. I know this was very much true for me. Not knowing what an engineer was when I showed up at the university, I thought engineers are guys who make stuff. Okay? I had to wait 4 years before I could make anything. I had this senior project, which didn't even work, and they gave me a degree anyway. Okay? So apparently they didn't care much about the making stuff part. In fact, there's a very straightforward analogy to that and what happens in music schools. Okay? One of the weird things about being a college president is you get asked to do all kinds of stuff that you don't know anything about. And one of these things was to be the chair of the Regional Accreditation Review Committee for several colleges in New England. One of them is the New England Conservatory of Music. Okay, so I did a whole week there. And then a year or two later, the accreditation of the Berklee College of Music. It's a completely different music school in Boston. The Berklee College of Music, you may not have heard of, is about jazz, contemporary music. It is the premier institute for jazz music in the country. Now, they both teach music, all right? But they do it very differently. The primary difference is that Berklee teaches improvisation, okay? New England Conservatory teaches execution of the notes that Beethoven wrote 200 years ago. And I think our education in engineering is much more like the New England Conservatory than it is the Berklee College of Music about improvising. And that's a real problem. That's where creativity, that's where these soft skills really come in. So if you had a really bright kid who was a prodigy on the piano and you needed to send him to a music academy, and you chose to send him to an academy that taught music the way the mainstream engineering schools teach engineering, here's how the experience might go. In the first year in this academy, they would learn about the theory of sound and vibration. They would study vibrating strings, mode shapes, and natural frequencies. The next year, they would learn about the theory of composition, point and counterpoint, melody and harmony. The third year, they would learn about orchestration, how do you blend the voices with the percussion and the woodwinds. And in the fourth year, if you're still here, we'll give you a piano and ask you to play real scales on this piano, and then we'll give you a music degree, okay? That's what we're doing to our kids in engineering today. We're giving them a way unbalanced view, all about just-in-case science, and we're not teaching them how to play the piano. The new way of teaching leads to a can-do attitude because they construct knowledge from the first day. They start with small, complete projects that are not very big, and by the time they graduate, they're doing really big projects that are embedded in companies like internships and co-ops, and they're making a difference. Can-do is really important. The old model teaches you to follow orders. The new model teaches you to follow your passions. It's intrinsically motivated. The old model says you learn in class. The new model says, nope, you learn all the time, 24/7. You learn alone. Don't talk to your neighbor. That's cheating. Put the pencil down. It's 8 o'clock. The new model says, no, you learn in teams. You learn constantly from others. The old model was problem-based. The new model is design-based. You don't know what the problem is. Your job is to diagnose it and to formulate a problem. And I claim none of this is new. This is not new. This is the way we've been teaching graduate education forever. This is what you did when you learned your PhD. You were the person who had the idea. You were the person who led this through. You had a mentor on the side, but you followed your passions. You studied 24/7. You learned with people in the pit. We used to call it where all the graduate students sat. And it was all about formulating and diagnosing your own problem. But you can only do that at the graduate level, right? No. Have you ever heard of the Montessori school? Do you know how they teach? K through 12 does this. PhD education does this. What happened in between? Undergraduate education, we industrialized. We made it efficient. We have rows and seats and blackboards, and we lost all of this authentic learning. My favorite quote from the book, for most of the 20th century, our educational system has been built on the assumption that teaching is necessary for learning to occur. Remember that graph that said on the left-hand side, the knowledge economy? That's what they mean, teaching. A teacher in front who is authoritarian, who knows all the answers, who tells you the stuff. And now what we found in the 21st century is the stuff on the right works too. Kids can learn all by themselves. Finally, my favorite quote from Chuck Vest. I don't know how many people know who Chuck Vest was? Most people do. Former president of MIT, president of the National Academy of Engineering, making universities and engineering schools exciting, creative, adventurous, rigorous, demanding, and empowering milieus, making it an adventure, which is what Jamie said earlier today, is more important than specifying curricular details. Don't copy the course notes, okay? Create the culture. That's what will change it. Last slide. Does Olin work? I mean, so we're doing these wacko things. I mean, we even had, in our first couple of years, we had a course at Olin. Our first course in physics was called Things That Go. Our second course in physics was called Things That Go Bang, and it looked very much like the video that you saw. And that was, before the folks in the town discovered that we had this going on, and then the safety and environmental people showed up, and we changed the name of our course now. Nevertheless, does it work? And this is a few of the indicators of what's happening at the school. The part that I'm most proud of personally is in the left-hand edge there about Princeton Review. Olin College last fall was rated number 3 in the country for students study the most. They do not have, this is not a party school. Secondly, they rated number 19 in the US as having the happiest students. We are the only technical school on both lists. I think it is possible to have kids that are intensely committed, are very competitive in engineering and science, and really love what they're doing. They really care about changing the world. That's what I had to say, and I'm finished. Thanks.